Imagine walking into your own business, only to be treated like you don't belong. That's exactly what happened to David, a successful Black entrepreneur who built his dream from the ground up. Dressed casually, he stepped into his upscale restaurant, expecting to check on things. But instead, he was met with cold stares and whispered conversations. Within minutes, a manager and a few staff members approached him, their expressions filled with judgment. "Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to leave," the manager said, his voice firm. David was stunned. "Excuse me. This establishment has a dress code, and we don't allow loitering." The humiliation burned. Customers watched as security was called, but before they could drag him out, someone rushed in, eyes wide with panic. That's when everything changed, because the man they were kicking out wasn't just a customer, he was the owner. The restaurant fell silent. The staff exchanged nervous glances as a senior employee rushed forward, whispering something urgently to the manager. But the damage had already been done. David stood there, his jaw clenched, watching as the people he had hired treated him like an outsider in his own business. Just days ago, he had finalized plans to expand the restaurant, investing even more into the very place now turning him away. He had built this from nothing, long hours, countless sacrifices, all to create a space of excellence. Yet, the very people he entrusted with his vision had judged him at first glance. The manager, still unaware of the full truth, crossed his arms. "I'm not going to ask again. You need to leave." David took a deep breath. He could feel all eyes on him. He had two choices: walk away or reveal the truth in a way they'd never forget. David stood his ground, his heart pounding, but his face remained calm. He had dealt with challenges before: discrimination, doubt, and people underestimating him. But this was personal. A few customers shifted uncomfortably in their seats, sensing the tension. One woman at the bar whispered to her friend, "Why are they making such a big deal? He's not bothering anyone." But the staff wasn't listening. The security guard, a tall man with a stiff stance, took a step forward. "Sir, we don't want any trouble." David studied their faces. The manager's expression was firm, convinced he was in the right. The hostess by the door avoided eye contact, almost as if she knew something wasn't right, but didn't dare speak up. And then there was the chef, peeking from the kitchen, brows furrowed, as if trying to place David's face. David finally spoke, his voice steady. "Tell me something. Do you treat all your customers this way?" The manager scoffed. "Only the ones who don't belong." A sharp silence filled the air. The weight of those words hung between them. David exhaled slowly. He had seen people reveal their true colors before, but hearing it said so plainly still stung. Just then, a familiar voice called from behind the counter. "Wait, I know who he is." The bartender's eyes widened with recognition. "That's David Carter." The name spread like wildfire through the room. Employees murmured among themselves, confusion and realization flashing across their faces. The manager frowned. "And who exactly is David Carter?" The bartender hesitated before answering. "He owns this place." The shift in energy was instant. The manager blinked, his confidence faltering. The security guard straightened. The hostess swallowed hard. The entire staff stood frozen, the weight of their mistake crushing down on them. David waited, watching their reactions. He could see the panic settling in, the silent battle between pride and regret playing out on their faces. But he wasn't here for apologies. He wanted to see what they would do next. The air in the restaurant felt heavy. No one moved, no one spoke. David stood in the center of it all, watching as the reality of their mistake sank in. The manager's face turned pale, his confidence draining with every second of silence. He opened his mouth as if to speak, then shut it again, glancing around, searching for some way to regain control. David could see the gears turning in his head. Was he going to double down, apologize, shift the blame? The entire staff was now looking at him, their expressions ranging from shock to guilt. The security guard stepped back, clearing his throat awkwardly. The hostess fidgeted with the menu in her hands, avoiding eye contact. The customers, once whispering, were now openly staring, some even recording on their phones. The tension was thick, and David let it hang for a moment longer. Then finally, the manager spoke. His voice was quieter now, but there was still an edge to it. "This must be some kind of misunderstanding," he said quickly. "If we had known." David raised a brow. "If you had known what?" His voice was calm, but there was no mistaking the challenge in his tone. The manager hesitated. "That you were the owner," he admitted. David let out a slow breath, shaking his head. "So, it's not about how you treat people. It's about who you think is worth treating with respect." The words landed hard. The manager swallowed, but he had no response. The room felt smaller now, the walls closing in on those who had made the wrong call. David could feel the weight of his next move. He could fire them all on the spot. He could walk away and let them sit with their own shame. Or he could make sure they truly understood the lesson they had just learned in the most unforgettable way possible. And as he took a step forward, all eyes remained locked on him, waiting, holding their breath, because they knew whatever happened next would change everything. David looked around the room, his mind racing with the weight of the moment. He had dealt with bias before, but standing in his own restaurant, being judged by his own staff, it cut deeper than he expected. He took another step forward, his presence commanding the space. The manager opened his mouth again, desperation creeping into his voice. "Listen, Mr. Carter, But before he could finish, the front doors swung open. A sharply dressed woman walked in, her heels clicking against the marble floor. She scanned the room, instantly picking up on the tension. It was Maya, David's business partner and co-owner. Her expression shifted from confusion to understanding as she spotted him standing in the middle of the mess. "What's going on here?" she asked, her voice firm. The manager turned, relieved to see someone else in charge. "Miss Anderson, there's been a mix-up. This gentleman." David crossed his arms. "Go ahead. Finish that sentence." The manager hesitated, realizing too late that there was no way to spin this in his favor. Maya's eyes narrowed. "Gentlemen, that's interesting," she said coolly. "Because the way I walked in, it looked more like you were trying to throw out the man who signs your paychecks." The color drained from the manager's face. David held up a hand. "No, let's get something straight. You didn't just make a mistake. You made a choice. A choice to judge someone based on nothing but your assumptions." His voice was steady, but there was no mistaking the sharp edge beneath it. Maya folded her arms. "And that choice, it's going to cost you." The staff exchanged nervous glances. The customers watched, waiting for what would come next. The manager stood frozen, his entire career hanging in the balance. But just when it seemed like things couldn't get worse, a new voice broke through the silence. "Excuse me," a man near the back of the restaurant called out. "I'd like to know if this is how you treat all your customers." David turned. The man, dressed in a sleek navy suit, leaned back in his chair, watching with quiet interest. There was something familiar about him. And then it hit David. He wasn't just any customer. He was an investor David had been in talks with for months. And now he had seen everything. The room felt even smaller now. Every eye in the restaurant shifted between David, Maya, and the man in the navy suit. The manager's breathing had grown uneven, and the staff stood frozen, realizing this situation was far bigger than they had thought. David exhaled slowly, his gaze locking onto the investor. He had been waiting weeks for a final meeting to seal a major deal, one that could take his business to the next level. But now, that meeting was happening under the worst possible circumstances. The investor leaned forward, adjusting his cufflinks. "I came here today to discuss business," he said, his tone measured. "But instead, I walk in and see the owner of this establishment being thrown out by his own staff." He glanced at the manager. "Is this how you usually run things?"